Something subtle has already failed. Not dramatically, not all at once, just enough that the explanations you used to lean on no longer settle anything. You notice it when you try to interpret your own reactions and the interpretation doesn't land. When you replay conversations, decisions, memories, and the familiar meanings slide off instead of locking into place. The internal commentary still starts up, but it doesn't resolve tension anymore. It circles, it stalls, it goes quiet at the wrong moments. This is not confusion in the ordinary sense. Confusion assumes that more clarity would help. What you're experiencing is the recognition that clarity itself has stopped functioning the way it used to. The frameworks that once organized your inner life are still present, but they no longer carry weight. They explain without stabilizing. They name without grounding. Something essential about how meaning used to work has broken down. This stage doesn't announce itself. It arrives as a loss of usefulness, and that loss is what you're feeling now. The first thing to understand is that interpretation is not neutral. It never was. For most of your life, interpretation acted as an invisible stabilizing force. You didn't experience life first and then interpret it later. Interpretation happened almost simultaneously. An event occurred, a feeling arose, and meaning stepped in immediately to frame it. This is what's happening. This is who I am in this situation. This is why I feel this way. That process reduced uncertainty before it had time to register. Because of that, interpretation became synonymous with stability. It wasn't just explaining experience, it was regulating it. By naming experiences quickly, you prevented them from expanding. By categorizing emotions, you kept them within known boundaries. Sadness had a cause, anger had a target, confusion had a solution. Meaning compressed experience into something manageable, something that could be carried forward without disrupting your sense of self. This is why interpretation feels so fundamental. It created continuity. It allowed one moment to connect cleanly to the next. It maintained a narrative thread that said, this fits, this belongs, this is part of a larger structure. And as long as that structure held, you could move through life with relative ease, even when circumstances were difficult. Pain still hurt, but it was legible. Uncertainty still existed, but it was temporary. Meaning made everything tolerable by making it placeable. When interpretation works, the nervous system responds immediately. Orientation returns. Tension lowers. There is a sense of internal alignment, even if the situation itself is unresolved. You may not know what comes next, but you know where you are, and knowing where you are is often enough. At this stage, that function has weakened. Interpretation still activates, almost automatically. You still analyze your emotions. You still search for psychological explanations. You can still articulate what you're experiencing with precision. But the result is different. The explanation lands without effect. The naming doesn't settle anything. The understanding doesn't restore balance. This is the crucial distinction. The problem is not that you don't understand what's happening. The problem is that understanding no longer stabilizes you. You might notice this when you catch yourself thinking, I know why I feel this way, and then realizing that the knowledge changes nothing. The tension remains. The restlessness remains. The sense of being unmoored remains. This is deeply unsettling because it contradicts a lifetime of conditioning. You were taught, implicitly and explicitly, that clarity leads to resolution. That insight leads to relief, that if you can just figure it out, you'll be okay. Here, that sequence breaks. Interpretation has reached the edge of its function, not because it is wrong, incomplete, or poorly applied, but because it has done everything it can do. It can still describe the terrain with accuracy. It can map the patterns. It can explain the mechanisms involved, but it can no longer organize your internal state around those explanations. In practical terms, this means meaning has lost its regulatory power. It used to act like an internal anchor. Now it behaves more like commentary, informative but inert. You can hear it, but it doesn't hold you in place. This is often misinterpreted as intellectual failure. People assume they've become dull, foggy, or incapable of insight. Or they interpret it emotionally, assuming they've gone numb, disconnected, or depressed. Both interpretations miss the point. Your cognitive capacity is intact. Your emotional range is still there. What has changed is the relationship between meaning and regulation. Meaning was doing more work than you realized. It wasn't just helping you understand life. It was quietly managing uncertainty, containing ambiguity, and preserving identity coherence. It told you what mattered and what didn't. It told you how much weight to assign to an experience. It filtered reality before it reached you fully. Now that filter is thinning. Without it, experiences arrive with less framing. Emotions feel harder to place. Situations feel oddly flat or strangely intense without a clear reason. The mind responds by trying harder to interpret, assuming that effort will restore the old balance. But effort doesn't help here because the limitation is structural, not motivational. This is why this phase feels confusing in a specific way. It's not confusion about facts or feelings. It's confusion about why your usual tools don't work. You're still using the same internal processes, but the outcome has changed. That discrepancy creates unease. It's important to say this clearly. This is not a personal failure. It's not a flaw in your thinking. It's not emotional weakness. It's a transition point where a previously reliable system no longer performs its original function. Interpretation was built to stabilize an identity that depended on continuity. As that identity reaches its limits, the system that supported it naturally loses effectiveness. Meaning doesn't disappear because you did something wrong. It fades because it's no longer sufficient to organize what you're becoming aware of. That's why forcing meaning back into place feels exhausting. You may notice a subtle resistance when you try to reassure yourself using familiar explanations. The words feel hollow. The conclusions feel thin. Not false, just inadequate. Something in you knows that the explanation doesn't reach deep enough anymore. This recognition can feel like loss. It can feel like something essential has been taken away. In a sense, that's true. But what's being lost is not understanding itself. It's the illusion that understanding alone could keep everything coherent. This stage is the moment when you realize that meaning was a support structure, not reality itself. And support structures, once outgrown, stop working quietly before they collapse completely. You are not failing to interpret your experience. You are encountering the point where interpretation no longer carries the weight it once did. That recognition, however uncomfortable, is the beginning of accuracy. Once interpretation stops stabilizing you, the mind does not slow down, it speeds up. This is the second pattern most people misunderstand. They expect that when something stops working, it will shut off. Instead, it intensifies. The system assumes the problem is insufficient effort, not a structural limit, so it applies more pressure. You think more, you analyze longer, you revisit past experiences with greater precision, you search for subtler explanations, deeper frameworks, more refined psychological language. The assumption underneath all of this is simple and largely unconscious. If interpretation worked before, then better interpretation should work now. But what's happening here is not insight, it's compensation. The mind is responding to the loss of regulation by increasing activity. This is not because you're becoming more aware. It's because the stabilizing effect of meaning has weakened, and the system is trying to recreate it through volume and intensity. More thinking feels like the only available move. At first, this acceleration can feel productive. You might notice brief moments of clarity, sharp observations, even a sense of intellectual sharpness. But these moments don't settle into anything. They don't accumulate. Each insight appears, registers, and then dissolves without changing your internal state. This is the key signal that you've crossed into this stage. Normally, insight reorganizes perception. It creates a sense of arrival. Here, insight behaves differently. It informs without orienting. It explains without anchoring. You understand more, but you feel no closer to stability. This creates a very specific kind of fatigue, not physical exhaustion and not emotional overwhelm in the usual sense. It's cognitive weariness paired with unresolved tension. You feel tired of thinking, but unable to stop. Rest doesn't help because the problem isn't effort, and effort doesn't help because the system you're relying on can't deliver what it used to. This is where people often begin to suspect something is wrong with them. They compare their current state to earlier periods of insight or growth and conclude that they've lost something: focus, depth, motivation, intelligence. None of those conclusions are accurate. What's actually happening is that interpretation has lost leverage. When meaning still regulated your system, thinking had a clear endpoint. You thought until something clicked, and then the system settled. That click no longer occurs. So thinking has no natural stopping point. It loops. It refines itself. It revisits the same material from slightly different angles, hoping that one of them will restore the missing sense of coherence. This looping is often mistaken for obsession or anxiety. It can resemble both, but it has a different root. Anxiety seeks safety. Obsession seeks certainty. This pattern seeks orientation. And orientation is exactly what interpretation can no longer provide. You may notice that even accurate conclusions feel strangely flat. You can arrive at a correct understanding of your situation and still feel internally unchanged. The explanation doesn't penetrate. It sits on the surface. This creates a subtle but persistent frustration that has no clear object. Because the mind has been trained to equate understanding with control, the failure of understanding feels like a loss of agency. You know what's happening, but you can't influence how it lands. That gap between comprehension and regulation is deeply destabilizing. This is also why reassurance fails at this stage. You might tell yourself that this is temporary, that it makes sense psychologically, that others have gone through similar phases. All of that may be true. None of it helps. The system isn't rejecting reassurance because it's pessimistic. It's rejecting it because reassurance relies on meaning to soothe, and meaning is no longer soothing. Another important feature of this stage is the loss of hierarchy. Normally, interpretation tells you what matters more and what matters less. It assigns weight. Some thoughts feel important, others are easily dismissed. When interpretation weakens, that filtering function breaks down. Everything feels equally unresolved. Minor concerns linger longer than they should. Major questions feel oddly distant. There is a flattening of significance. This contributes to the sense that nothing is moving, even though the mind is constantly active. At this point, many people push harder. They read more. They seek more explanations. They stack frameworks on top of each other, hoping one will finally land. This often deepens the exhaustion. Not because the material is wrong, but because the issue isn't lack of information. It's that the system that used to integrate information has paused. What you're encountering here is the limit of interpretation as a primary organizing principle. The mind can still generate explanations indefinitely. But without the regulatory effect those explanations once had, they pile up without resolving anything. This can create a sense of internal noise paired with emotional emptiness. Thoughts keep coming, but they don't lead anywhere. This is often when people fear they are losing depth or becoming detached. In reality, the opposite is true. The usual buffers have dropped away, leaving you closer to raw experience, but without the familiar tools to manage it. It's important to understand that this acceleration is not something to overcome or suppress. It's a transitional response. The system is doing what it has always done when stability is threatened: increase control through cognition. The problem is not the response itself, but the assumption behind it. The assumption is that more interpretation will fix the problem. It won't. Because the problem is not insufficient meaning. It's that meaning has reached its functional limit in this phase. Until that is recognized, the mind will continue to overwork itself, mistaking effort for progress. This is why this stage feels so draining. You are expending energy without receiving orientation in return. That imbalance cannot be sustained indefinitely. Eventually, the system will have to acknowledge that interpretation is no longer the tool that restores balance. That acknowledgement doesn't come as an insight. It comes as exhaustion. And exhaustion, in this context, is not failure. It's the first sign that the system is beginning to let go of a strategy that no longer works. When interpretation loses its stabilizing power and mental effort begins to exhaust itself, the body becomes impossible to ignore. This is the third shift, and it often arrives quietly. Attention starts drifting away from explanations and toward sensation, not deliberately, not by choice, simply because the body is no longer being regulated by meaning. For most of your life, interpretation acted as a mediator between experience and sensation. It decided how much of an experience reached the body. When something happened, meaning framed it quickly, telling the nervous system whether to mobilize, relax, brace, or move on. In that sense, interpretation functioned as a regulator long before you were aware of it. When that regulation weakens, the body is left without clear instruction. This is why physical sensations become more pronounced at this stage, not dramatic symptoms, but persistent signals. A low-level restlessness that doesn't resolve, a heaviness in the chest without identifiable emotion, fatigue that appears without obvious cause. These sensations are not messages to be decoded. They are the result of a nervous system that has lost its usual orientation cues. The body does not operate on explanations. It operates on patterns of safety and threat, activation and rest, meaning used to translate experience into those patterns. Now that translation is incomplete. The body senses ambiguity, and ambiguity keeps it alert. This is why you may feel tired and wired at the same time, restless but unmotivated, alert without direction. The system is not in crisis, but it is not at ease. It's waiting for a signal that never arrives. People often misread this state as anxiety or depression. It can resemble both, but it isn't identical to either. Anxiety usually has an object, even if that object is vague. Depression usually carries a sense of heaviness tied to loss or hopelessness. What's happening here is different. There is no clear fear and no clear sadness. There is simply a lack of resolution. The body is responding to the absence of structure, not the presence of danger. This is also why trying to think your way out of the sensations doesn't help. You might notice that you explain what you're feeling accurately, and the sensation remains unchanged. The explanation doesn't penetrate. This can be alarming, because it suggests that the usual hierarchy has reversed. The body no longer follows the mind. In reality, the body has always been primary. Interpretation just made that easy to forget. At this stage, the nervous system is doing something very specific. It is scanning without orientation. It is holding energy without a clear release point. This creates a background hum of tension that doesn't spike and doesn't settle. Over time, that hum becomes more noticeable simply because nothing is dampening it. This can lead to a sense of internal distance from your own reactions. You notice sensations without immediately knowing what they mean. The familiar pathway from sensation to interpretation to response is interrupted. There is a pause where there used to be automatic clarity. That pause is not a malfunction. It's a consequence of the old regulatory system stepping back. Another important shift here is the loss of urgency. The body holds energy, but it doesn't convert easily into action. You may feel alert, but unable to move forward decisively. Tasks that once felt straightforward now feel oddly draining, not because they are difficult, but because they no longer carry intrinsic momentum. Meaning used to supply that momentum. It told the body, this matters, move. Without that signal, action feels arbitrary. The body hesitates, conserving energy rather than deploying it. This is why motivation often collapses at this stage without sadness or resistance. It simply doesn't appear, not because you don't care, but because caring used to be mediated by meaning. Without meaning assigning value, the body doesn't know where to invest itself. This can create a false sense of detachment. You may think you've become disconnected from life, from others, from yourself, but what's actually happening is a withdrawal of automatic engagement. The system is no longer being pushed forward by interpretations that once made everything feel necessary. The body is not shutting down, it is waiting for orientation that does not come from explanation. This is why trying to force calm often backfires. Relaxation techniques, reassurances, even rest can feel ineffective. The system isn't overstimulated in the usual way. It's suspended. It doesn't need to be calmed. It needs to be accurately recognized. What you're feeling in your body is not a problem to solve. It's a state to be understood. A nervous system without a map does not relax by being told it's safe. It relaxes when orientation returns. At this stage, orientation cannot be supplied by interpretation. That's the core tension. The body has stepped forward because the mind's organizing role has paused. Sensation has replaced explanation as the dominant signal, not because sensation holds the answer, but because the old filter has lifted. This is what it feels like when the system is between structures. And the discomfort you feel is not a sign of imbalance. It's the felt experience of transition, registered where interpretation can no longer intervene. As the body takes precedence and interpretation continues to lose its authority, another shift becomes apparent. The internal narrative begins to fragment, not collapse all at once, but thin out. The story you've been telling yourself about who you are, what you're moving toward, and how your experiences connect, starts to feel less convincing. It doesn't disappear. It just stops asserting itself automatically. For most of your life, this narrative ran quietly in the background. It didn't require effort. It linked past events to present identity and projected both into the future. Even when you questioned it, the questioning occurred within the narrative itself. You were still inside a story that gave your experiences a sense of direction and coherence. Interpretation was the engine of that story. When interpretation weakens, the narrative loses momentum. You may still remember the facts of your life, but they no longer arrange themselves into a meaningful sequence. Memories feel flatter. Achievements feel distant. Mistakes lose their emotional charge. This isn't repression or detachment. It's the loosening of narrative glue. This can be deeply unsettling because identity is largely constructed through continuity. You know who you are because your experiences form a recognizable pattern over time. When that pattern stops reinforcing itself, the sense of self becomes less defined, not absent, but vague. You might notice longer pauses between thoughts, gaps where opinions used to arise immediately. Situations that once triggered predictable reactions now produce hesitation instead. This is often misread as indecision or loss of confidence. In reality, it's the absence of automatic narrative interpretation. The mind no longer rushes to answer the question, "What does this say about me?" And without that question driving perception, experiences arrive without being absorbed into identity. This can feel like emptiness, but it's a specific kind of emptiness. It's not the absence of feeling, it's the absence of storyline. Without a storyline, experiences don't accumulate into meaning. They occur and pass without being woven into a larger sense of self. This is where many people fear they are losing themselves. They compare their current state to a previous version that felt more defined, more motivated, more certain. They assume something has gone wrong. But what's actually happening is that identity, as a narrative structure, is no longer being actively maintained. That maintenance required constant interpretation. Every experience had to be framed, explained, and integrated. Without that process, the identity it supported naturally loses clarity. It's important to understand that this doesn't mean there is no self present. It means the self is no longer being constructed moment by moment through meaning. The sense of I becomes quieter, less insistent, not because it's disappearing, but because it's no longer being narrated. This quieting often brings a strange mix of relief and unease. Relief, because the pressure to perform a consistent identity diminishes. Unease, because consistency provided orientation. Without it, there is no clear reference point. You may notice that you stop identifying strongly with roles that once felt central. Work, relationships, personal traits, even long-held values may feel less defining. Not rejected, just less gripping. They no longer organize your sense of self the way they used to. This is not disinterest, it's decoupling. The internal narrative also structured time. It linked past effort to future outcome. Without it, the future feels harder to imagine, not threatening, just abstract. You may struggle to project yourself forward in a meaningful way, not because you lack imagination, but because the narrative framework that made projection feel real has loosened. This is often when people describe feeling in between, not who they were, not yet anything else. That description is accurate, but incomplete. What's actually in between is the narrative mechanism itself. The old story has stopped generating momentum, and no new story has stabilized yet. Importantly, this is not a problem to be solved. Trying to construct a new narrative too quickly often feels forced or hollow. Any story built on the old interpretive system will carry the same limitations. That's why attempts to redefine yourself at this stage often feel artificial. The system is not asking for a new identity, it's pausing identity construction altogether. This pause creates space, but not in a comforting way. It removes the constant commentary that told you who you were being in each moment. Without that commentary, there is less self-reference, less internal positioning. What remains is experience without immediate ownership. That can feel destabilizing because ownership has been a core organizing principle. Experiences happen to you, as you, for a reason. Now they simply happen. This does not mean identity is gone. It means identity, as a narrative process, has stepped back, and until interpretation regains a different form of authority, the story will remain quiet. This quiet is not absence. It is suspension. And suspension, in this context, is not something to fix. It is the natural state of a system that has reached the end of one way of organizing itself and has not yet begun another. As the internal narrative loosens and identity stops reinforcing itself, time begins to behave differently. Not objectively, but subjectively. The way you relate to past and future changes in subtle but profound ways. This shift often goes unnoticed at first because it doesn't announce itself as disorientation. It shows up as a quiet loss of pull. For most of your life, time had direction. The past informed the present, and the present pointed toward the future. Effort was justified by outcome. Sacrifice was supported by expectation. Even uncertainty carried momentum because it was framed as temporary, meaning linked moments together and gave time its shape. When interpretation weakens, that linkage dissolves. The future no longer exerts the same gravitational force. Plans feel abstract, goals feel oddly distant, even if you can still name them. It's not that you don't care. It's that caring used to be sustained by narrative projection. You acted in the present because the future felt real and consequential. Without that felt continuity, action loses urgency. This is often misinterpreted as laziness or burnout, but burnout usually carries frustration or resentment. What's happening here is quieter. The future simply doesn't register with the same intensity. It's not avoided, it's just less convincing. At the same time, the past loses its instructional authority. Memories still exist, but they no longer guide you as reliably. Lessons learned feel less applicable. Past successes don't energize. Past failures don't warn in the same way. They feel like records of another configuration of self, not templates for the present. This creates a flattening of time. Moments no longer feel clearly stacked in a progression. They sit alongside each other without hierarchy. Today doesn't feel like a step toward tomorrow. Tomorrow doesn't feel like a necessary destination. This can be deeply unsettling in a culture that equates direction with health. You may feel as though you've stalled, even if nothing external has changed. The sense of movement that once carried you forward is gone, and with it the reassurance that you're on track. But this loss of momentum is not stagnation. It's the absence of narrative propulsion. Meaning used to convert time into pressure. It told you what should happen next and why it mattered. Without that pressure, time opens up in an unfamiliar way. It stretches, it becomes less dense. Minutes feel longer, days feel less distinct. You might notice yourself lingering in moments without intention, not present in a cultivated way, but simply unpulled. The drive to optimize, improve, or advance fades. Not because you've given up, but because the structure that made advancement feel necessary has paused. This is also why decision-making becomes harder at this stage. Decisions rely on temporal hierarchy, They require a sense of what leads somewhere better. When the future no longer carries weight, choices lose their comparative value. Options appear equivalent, not because they are, but because the system that evaluates outcomes is offline. This can feel like indifference, but it isn't. Indifference rejects engagement. What you're experiencing is suspended engagement. The system is not withdrawing, it's waiting for a different form of orientation. It's important to understand that this phase is not about living in the present. That framing still relies on meaning. It assumes that presence itself is a value to be achieved. What's happening here is more basic. The temporal framework that once structured your experience is no longer active. Time has not stopped, but the story that made time directional has. This often leads to concern about falling behind. You may compare yourself to others and feel strangely disconnected from their pace. Their urgency seems foreign. Their milestones feel arbitrary. This doesn't mean you've lost ambition or relevance. It means the metric you use to measure progress no longer applies. Without narrative continuity, time becomes less instrumental. It is no longer a means to an end. It is simply the medium in which experience unfolds. This can feel empty at first. The absence of pressure is not immediately peaceful. It can feel disorienting, even threatening. But that reaction comes from a system trained to equate movement with safety. Here, safety is not produced by forward motion. It hasn't been replaced by anything yet. This is why trying to force momentum often fails. You can attempt to push yourself into action, but the effort feels mechanical. The internal justification is missing. The why doesn't carry force. This stage is not asking you to reclaim time or redefine the future. It is revealing that time, as you experienced it, was structured by meaning. And without that structure, time becomes open, undecided, and strangely neutral. This neutrality is not the end of direction. It is the pause before a different relationship with time takes form. And in that pause, the absence of urgency is not a flaw. It is the accurate reflection of a system no longer organized by the narratives that once drove it forward. As time loses its pull and narrative pressure fades, a quieter resistance begins to surface. It doesn't announce itself as defiance or refusal. It shows up as a subtle unwillingness to re-engage with explanations that once felt sufficient. You may notice that familiar interpretations still make sense intellectually, but something in you won't assent to them anymore. This resistance is not conscious. You're not deciding to reject old meanings, they simply fail to land. When you try to reassure yourself with conclusions you once trusted, the words feel thin. They don't penetrate. There is no internal yes. This can be alarming because it feels like you've lost agreement with your own mind. But what you're encountering is not rebellion, it's a boundary. Interpretation depends on internal consent. For meaning to stabilize you, some deeper layer has to accept it as relevant and sufficient. At this stage, that layer has withdrawn its cooperation. Not out of cynicism, but because the interpretations no longer correspond to your internal state. This is why encouragement fails here, not because you're pessimistic and not because you've become resistant to help. Encouragement relies on the assumption that meaning still has leverage. It assumes that reminding yourself why something matters will restore engagement. When meaning has lost authority, encouragement becomes noise. The same applies to reassurance. You can tell yourself that this phase is normal, that it will pass, that nothing is wrong. Those statements may be accurate, they still don't calm the system. The nervous system is not rejecting reassurance out of fear. It's rejecting it because reassurance presumes a framework that is no longer active. This is often misunderstood as stubbornness or emotional blockage. People assume they're stuck because they won't let go of something or because they're unconsciously resisting change. That framing misses what's actually happening. There is no clinging here. There is no refusal to move forward. There is simply a refusal to accept meanings that no longer fit. This resistance is precise. It does not reject everything, it rejects the familiar. You might notice that when someone offers a neat explanation for what you're going through, your body responds with quiet skepticism. Not intellectual disagreement, but a physical sense of no. The explanation might be elegant, it might be compassionate, It might even be something you would have agreed with in the past. Now it feels insufficient. This is not because you've become difficult, it's because the system has learned something important. Returning to the old interpretive layer would be dishonest. Once meaning collapses, forcing it back into place creates internal friction. The system recognizes the mismatch immediately. This is why attempts to get back to normal often feel exhausting rather than comforting. You can play the role, you can repeat the language, but something underneath refuses to participate. That refusal is often mistaken for loss of motivation or discipline. In reality, it's integrity at a structural level. The system will not stabilize itself with explanations that no longer reflect its actual configuration. This is also where detachment is frequently misdiagnosed. You may feel less emotionally reactive, less invested, less compelled to respond. Others may interpret this as withdrawal. But what's happening is that the automatic hooks have disengaged. The interpretations that once told you how to feel and how strongly to feel are no longer issuing commands. This can look like calm from the outside. Internally, it often feels like suspension. You're not reacting, not because you're above it, but because the meaning that once triggered reaction is absent. This is a vulnerable stage because it's easy to pathologize this resistance, to label it as avoidance, fear, or failure. Doing so adds another layer of interpretation that the system cannot integrate. It increases pressure without restoring orientation. What's actually happening is simpler, though not easier. The system has reached a point where it will not accept borrowed meaning. It requires something more fundamental, but it doesn't yet know what that is. This is why trying to replace old interpretations with new ones often fails. You might experiment with different frameworks, perspectives, or philosophies. Some may resonate briefly, none of them settle. The system recognizes that these are still interpretations, still attempts to organize experience from the same level that has already reached its limit. This is not a call to abandon thinking or explanation altogether. It's a recognition that explanation cannot lead right now. The resistance you feel is not blocking movement, it is preventing regression. Without this resistance, it would be easy to retreat into familiar narratives simply to escape discomfort. The fact that you can't do that anymore is not a loss of flexibility. It's a sign that the transition is real. At this stage, the system is protecting itself from premature closure. It will not allow you to resolve the discomfort by accepting meanings that no longer correspond to your lived experience. That protection feels like friction because it operates below conscious choice. You might feel caught between wanting relief and rejecting the very things that once provided it. This tension is not something to resolve. It is the defining feature of this phase. The resistance is not against growth, insight, or clarity. It is against false stabilization. Until orientation returns in a different form, the system will remain selective, withholding consent from interpretations that no longer carry truth at the level that matters. This is not indecision. It is discernment without a framework. And while it may feel like nothing is happening, this resistance is actively shaping what cannot happen anymore. It is closing a door that cannot be reopened without distortion. That closure is not dramatic. It is quiet, firm, and irreversible. And it marks the point where the system commits, not to an outcome, but to accuracy over comfort. By the time this stage is reached, something fundamental has become clear without being fully articulated. The search for meaning has stopped producing movement. Interpretation no longer leads forward, and resistance prevents a return to what once worked. What remains is not insight and not confusion, but a kind of stillness that doesn't feel chosen. This is the point where many people assume something is missing, that the next step simply hasn't been discovered yet. That if they could just find the right frame, the right explanation, the right perspective, everything would begin to move again. But this assumption belongs to the old structure. It presumes that progress is generated by interpretation. Here, that logic no longer applies. What you are encountering is not the absence of meaning, but the suspension of it. Meaning has not been destroyed. It has stepped out of its organizing role. And in its absence, Nothing rushes in to replace it. There is no immediate substitute. No new structure asserts itself. This can feel like standing in open space without reference points. There is no urgency, but there is also no reassurance. The system is not collapsing, but it is not rebuilding either. It is holding. This holding is often misread as stagnation, but stagnation implies blockage. What's happening here is pause, a pause that is not strategic and not voluntary. It emerges because the system has exhausted one way of organizing experience and cannot yet adopt another. At this stage, the temptation is to interpret the pause itself, to assign it meaning, to label it as preparation, healing, growth, or failure. But even these interpretations fail to settle. They feel like overlays placed on something that resists being named. That resistance is important. The pause exists precisely because premature meaning would distort what is happening. Any attempt to frame this state too quickly collapses it back into the old system. The absence of narrative is not a void to be filled. It is a condition that allows something more accurate to take shape, though its form is not yet visible. This is why the stillness feels heavy rather than peaceful. Peace implies resolution. This stillness has none. It is unresolved by nature. It does not offer comfort or direction. It simply holds the system in place, preventing false movement. You may notice that you are less inclined to explain yourself to others, not because you've withdrawn, but because explanations feel inadequate. Language no longer captures what's happening internally. Words either overstate or trivialize the experience. Silence becomes more accurate, even if it's uncomfortable. This is also where agency begins to reappear in a different form, not as motivation or intention, but as restraint. You are no longer compelled to act on meanings that don't ring true. You are no longer pulled into narratives that promise clarity, but deliver distortion. This restraint is subtle. It doesn't feel like control. It feels like standing still because movement would be dishonest. That honesty is not a virtue you're practicing. It's a condition you're in. At this stage, there is nothing to resolve, nothing to fix, nothing to optimize. The system has entered a phase where its previous organizing principles have fallen away, and no new principles have taken hold. That can feel like loss, but it is more accurate to call it neutrality. In neutrality, experience is no longer filtered through urgency or expectation. It is registered without immediate translation into meaning. This can feel stark, even bleak, because so much of what once animated life came from interpretation. Without it, things appear plain, sometimes flat. But plainness is not emptiness. It is experience without amplification. This is why attempts to move on feel premature. Movement implies direction, and direction implies meaning. Neither is available yet. Forcing either creates friction that the system now refuses. What remains is a boundary between what no longer organizes you and what has not yet formed. Standing here does not require insight or effort, it requires accuracy. The accuracy of not pretending that meaning still works when it doesn't. There is no lesson to extract from this stage, no takeaway to apply. Its function is not to teach, but to hold. And holding, in this context, is not passive. It is the system maintaining coherence by refusing distortion. You are not meant to cross this threshold quickly. You are meant to recognize where you are without turning it into a story. The pause does not ask you to understand it. It asks you to let it be what it is. And in that restraint, without explanation or anticipation, agency returns quietly, not as a plan, but as the capacity to remain here without collapsing back into what no longer fits. Nothing needs to resolve right now. If you're waiting for a moment where this state turns into clarity, or meaning reasserts itself in a familiar way, that expectation belongs to an earlier structure. What you're standing in does not lead forward on command, and it does not explain itself on demand. That does not mean you are stuck. It means the system is no longer willing to organize itself around interpretations that no longer match reality. That refusal is not confusion, it is accuracy. You are not missing an insight, you are not failing to integrate something. The quiet, the flatness, the lack of narrative pull, these are not signs of absence. They are signs that the old mechanisms have stepped aside. There is nothing you need to add to this moment, no meaning to assign, no conclusion to reach. Agency, here, is not about choosing a direction, it's about not forcing one. You are still present, still responsive, still capable. What has changed is not your capacity to engage with life, but the terms under which engagement occurs. Standing at this boundary does not require belief or effort. It requires restraint. The restraint to not explain this away. The restraint to not retreat into familiar language just to feel oriented again. This phase ends when it ends, not because it was solved, but because something else becomes available. Until then, there is nothing wrong with being here. And there is nothing missing from you for finding yourself in this place.